Thanks a lot for including us in the program. And as said, this is joint work with Markus Sihvonen, who will be then discussing the next paper. So we're both here. Okay, so consider two euro denominated investments with let's say same duration. So alternative one, we buy a German bond. Alternative two, we buy an Italian bond plus a CDS that neutralizes the credit risk. So what in essence we have is a synthetic safe bond. Now the textbook asset pricing models would say that these two portfolios or these two investments should trade with roughly the same yield, or with the same yield if other parameters are the same. Now what happens, or what we observe from the markets, is that actually the synthetic option or alternative, so that trades roughly with a 40 basis points higher yield. Now there's a new found, or I guess it has always been there, but now there's a new policy interest also towards this spread, and the ECB announced in July 2020 the transmission protection instrument, which in essence they say that like if this spread, or if the spread between the Italian or other Eurozone countries grows too wide in reference to German bond, they can act, and they leave it unspecified with the country-specific fundamentals. So this gap has several names. We adopt from the Yang et al. Paper. So they discuss convenience yields, but they look at this phenomenon from the viewpoint of the issuers or the governments. But we look at it from the viewpoint of the investor. So we call this spread the inconvenience yield. And basically what we're saying is that the investor who chooses the synthetic version, so they get to enjoy this 40 basis points on average due to some inconvenience premium. So how do we, so just to formalize the previous slide, so the ICY, so the inconvenience yield is the raw yield of, let's say, Italian bond minus the CDS minus the German bond yield, and then we control also for the German CDS, which is small. So what do we do in the paper? So first, we have a model with two key assumptions that can explain some of the key facts that I will show in a minute about these inconvenience curves. The two assumptions that or the main assumptions that we have is that first, the funding costs on this riskier, on this synthetic alternative is higher than the German alternative. And then second, these funding costs are in future are uncertain and the investors are risk averse. Then two, we offer causal evidence based on Eurosystem haircuts for this mechanism. And then three, we lay out how the changes in these inconvenience yields are key for monetary policy transmission to yields. Okay, so first the facts or the characteristics of this inconvenience yield. So the first is that riskier bonds measured by the credit risk or the CDS premia have a higher inconvenience yield in the cross section of countries. So here on the x-axis we have the CDS premium, and on the y-axis we have the average inconvenience yield in our sample from 2012 until 2021. We see the same relationship in time series too. So increasing credit risk means increasing convenience yield, but it's not as strong in the time series. So that brings me to the stylized fact number two. So these inconvenience yields are associated with funding costs and funding risks. So the first specification here that shows basically the time series relationship between the credit risk and the inconvenience yield. So we see a slightly significant positive relationship. But then the specification number 2, we see that the funding rate, so here measured by the repo rate for these respective bonds, so that is associated with the higher inconvenience yield. The specification number 3 shows that the inconvenience yield slope, so the 10-year inconvenience yield minus the 1-year inconvenience yield, so that's associated with, in the cross section, associated with higher funding risks. And here we approximate the funding risks with the repo rate volatility. Okay, and then the third fact is that the inconvenience curve on average is upward sloping. So here we have averaged through different countries and through our sample. This holds also for the country-specific inconvenience yield curves. Okay, so then to make sense of these facts, so we introduce a model based on the Vajanos and Bila 20 paper, but now we have 2 countries. One is riskless, or the bond of one of the countries is riskless, and then the other country has a bond with credit risk. And these bonds have differential funding costs. So we have investors who trade all the bonds, and then we have preferred habitat investors who would like to own one of these bonds. Now the key assumption here coming from these empirical facts is that we model the additional funding cost for the risky bond. We model it so that it's a function of the credit risk, so default probability, and then also amount of the bonds financed. And this is where the stochasticity comes into the model, so that the demand shocks from these preferred habitat investors is stochastic, so that the arbitrageurs may need to step into the markets and fund a larger part of the market, and then the funding costs will go higher. I won't go through the whole model, but I'll just introduce the key result that we have in the paper as proposition 2, which tells us that the inconvenience yield in this setup is roughly the funding cost, and then there's a funding risk part. Now, when we go to the short end of the inconvenience yield curve, the funding cost dominates, and then in the longer end, we will also have the funding risk. Basically, or this is exactly the empirical association that I presented earlier. That in the long end, we have funding cost and risks. In the short end, we have funding costs that explain the inconvenience yield. Okay, then causal evidence for this key mechanism. So an investor in the European bond market, so if they rely on external funding to fund their bond position, so they can either take the funding from the unsecured market, which is very expensive. Then if they go to the secured or collateralized market, so they can either use repo market or then the Eurosystem funding programs. Now the Eurosystem TLTROs are competitive for the Italian bonds, but not so much for the German. The funding cost for this Italian bond depends basically on 2 parameters. So first, the funding rate, so the interest rate that you can get funding for your bond. And the second is the haircut, meaning the over-collateralization parameter that the Eurosystem imposes. Now, these haircuts for the Italian bonds, so they are a function of the maturity of the bond. And in particular, there are a stepwise function so that the maturities are bucketed together. And then, like, for example, a bond in the maturity bucket or all bonds that have maturities from 10 to say 7 years have the same haircut. And then when the bond switches the maturity bucket from 10 to 7 to 7 to 5, so there's a stepwise function or decrease in the haircut. And now we argue that this step, or like the date when this haircut change happens, is actually more or less random, as it depends only on the issue date and the current date. and then the bond or the threshold, or how the maturity buckets are organized. Now, so this is then the key result. So here we try to explain the change in Italian bond yields. HCI is an indicator variable for the date when this haircut change due to the maturity bucket change happens. These haircuts are published at the ECB's website every day at 6. So the date when this haircut changes, we see a small but insignificant statistically change. But then the next day, we have a highly significant impact on the bond's yield. We do the same exercise in the paper for German bonds, and we do it for the CDSs. And then we do it also for the Italian bonds, so that when the maturity part of the bond or the integer part of the maturity changes, so let's say, for example, it goes from 9 year to 8 year, so that it changes the year but not the bucket, so then there's no effect.
So is that a basis point or?
Yeah, exactly. So we can go into the details, but like that means that it goes down exactly 0.4 basis points. And then in total, like these 3 days amount to roughly like little less than 1 basis point. Okay, and then finally, I'll just show our results so that we have done a variance decomposition on the dates of unconventional monetary policy to see how much of this policy or introduction of these policies, how much of the impact goes from the inconvenience yield and how much from the other channels. So we see that on average it's roughly 50% that comes from the inconvenience yield, and then for these collateral policy related changes a higher percentage. Yeah. Okay, so just to conclude, so we have 2 key assumptions that we can with which we can explain the Eurozone sovereign inconvenience curves. These are that first, the funding cost on the riskier bonds, the periphery bonds are higher, and then second, they are also uncertain and we have risk-averse investors. 2, we offer this causal evidence that this is the key mechanism that we see also in the empirical data. And then 3, we show that this is actually important channel for the monetary policy. So that's what we do, and looking forward for the comments.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I think now we have Florian from the Bundesbank joining us for discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, let's wait for the slides. All right, so first of all, thanks for the presentation and thanks for inviting me as a discussant. And now it's my pleasure to discuss your paper. So the paper starts with a very basic notion. Next slide, please. That collateral matters. I mean, borrower want collateral because it gives them access to a cheaper source of funding, and this is why they are willing to pay a little bit extra for that to the issuer of that security. And this is the convenience yield, collateral benefit. There are different names, as you said yourself. And this is well studied, but something which is not so well studied is how it behaves across the maturity spectrum. Next. And this is precisely where this paper comes in. It empirically, but also theoretically, tries to disentangle that term structure of the inconvenience yield. That's how they call it. And that's an empirical contribution on the one hand side and a theoretical on the other, because they provide a micro foundation for this shape, which is a point where many papers, mine included, take a shortcut. And next slide, how are they doing it? Basically twofold, theoretical approach and empirical. I already said that. And on the next slide, I can brief on the next slide actually, because it gives you an overview about the basic mechanism, but you already explained that well. So just go to the slide until it's fully shown, then I don't have to say it all the time. Okay, so the mechanism is quite easy. It starts with risk-averse investors that buy a certain bond and need to finance this. And their financing cost depends on two parts, some constant and some other part, which includes their holdings of this bond. And since there's also another type of investor whose demand is uncertain, basically the amount the arbitrager has to finance is uncertain, which together with them being risk averse and skipping a few steps leads to this very basic equation that you also showed as your key result. And as you said, there are two policy implications for that. One is that this inconvenience curve is upward sloping precisely because risk becomes more important on the longer end of the maturity spectrum. So this is increasing. And this is also something you already showed in your stylized facts. And then, and this is basically the empirical part of your paper, you basically look at how monetary policy, either through ISO purchases or changes of the framework, actually affects that. And before I come to that empirical part, let me briefly talk about or give you my comments on the theory, why we still have it in mind. So next slide, also like next. And okay, so two comments. So the first one concerns the presence of discounting. So arbitrageurs discount with the risk-free rate. So you have that equation in your paper, and it also shows up in the price of the bond. But then I would expect it also affects yields, and thereby also this inconvenience yield, which is really the difference between the Italian and German government bond here. But it didn't show up, or at least in your stylized equation that I just showed, it's not clear to me how this comes in, because, yeah, discounting should be there. It wouldn't alter your results, obviously, because the mechanism is still there, but it could, in a sense, probably weaken it a bit. Depends on, yeah, how strong that is. And then a minor comment also related to this, I didn't find the parameters or the calibration of those parameters. So that's my first comment on the theoretical part. My second one concerns this excess funding cost. That's how they label basically the funding cost of the arbitrageur, which, as I said, has those two pieces, some constant, lambda, and this integral, which is basically the holding, or the part the arbitrageur has to finance of its investments. Now, my comment actually concerns the second part. I mean, intuitively, if you think about it, the more you try to fund as an arbitrageur, probably the more you have to pay. That's intuitive for private markets, for sure. But if I think about central bank credit operations, this is not so clear to me. I mean, in those central bank credit operations, irrespective of how much you borrow or already borrowed, you pay the same rate. So this excess funding cost shouldn't really different or grow with the amount that you already borrowed. So if I think about this excess funding cost increasing, I'm actually more thinking about something you, I think, ruled out in the paper, which is the risk of the issuer. You have this constant default risk instead in the paper. But I actually wondered why that is. I mean, those arbitrageurs in your model, they're basically the financial industry, which then also holds most of those issued government bonds, and thereby the more that is out there, the more the credit risk of the issuer. So that was actually how I thought about this term. Okay, and then next slide, please. I'm going to skip the details of the empirical analysis. I think the only thing that's important here is that it basically evolves around showing how relevant this inconvenience yield is and how monetary policy affects this inconvenience yield. And next slide. The way they do this is basically by disentangling the contribution and yield differences between Italian and German government bonds that are due to credit risk and due to this inconvenience yield. And yeah, on this empirical analysis, the first thing I thought about is, what about liquidity? So those bonds, I mean, they're government bonds and highly liquid, surely, but there might be liquidity differences between those bonds. And I wonder how you actually account for them. I first thought because you match like Italian and German government bonds, probably this is part of the matching procedure. But the way I read it in the paper, the matching is more to closest maturity bond and not also with respect to, I don't know, liquidity bid-ask spread. So this is something I wondered. And then second, and this unfortunately you didn't show in your regressions, you have this implication that, for example, as if the central bank changes its collateral framework, which would in this excess funding cost be the constant, this also changes the inconvenience yield and more so on the long end of the maturity spectrum. So that's the theoretical implication here. And you do actually try to show that when you look at the announcement effects of purchase programs and how they affected yields. So central bank purchase programs, that is. But you also have this regression that that you showed initially, where you look at those haircut changes, and you also have, at least in the version of the paper I knew, or I read, an interaction between the haircut change and the maturity bucket for bonds. And there I would have actually expected that, yeah, you can also make the point with this regression and not so much with the announcement effects. And then last, yeah, bunch of minor comments, so robustness comments. I only, I don't know how much time I have left. So, okay, great. So for one, you do this analysis for Italy, and I guess that's one for data availability. So I guess it's easier or very easy for Italy to get a sufficient amount of data. But then the obvious question, because this initial graph you showed us, it also takes into account Spain, for example. What if you extend this to the other countries in your set? And then, I said you match Italian and German government bonds. And something you mentioned in the paper is that the matching is not always perfect. But then you don't offer basically a comment of how important that sometimes imperfect matching is for your results. So then this is the obvious question that came into my mind here. And then last, you also showed us your decomposition of announcement effects of, I don't know, collateral policy change, Mario Draghi's speech, whatever it takes speech, for example. And for those different types of announcements, you only look at announcements that affected sovereign bonds. So, for example, collateral changes related to sovereign bonds, collateral framework changes with respect to government bonds. But I actually wondered why you restrict yourself only to those types of bonds, because investors, they have a whole portfolio of different assets, also, for example, corporate bonds. And I guess what matters for what they pay is the whole amount of collateral they have, and not only the specific type of collateral they have. So this is something that I wondered. And then finally, on the next slide, which is also my last, a last comment on the introduction. So basically the motivation focuses, as I said, on secured lending, collateral matters. But I thought the paper is actually broader than that, because whenever there's eligibility for a bond, so for example, you're a regulator, or there's regulation, certain bonds count into this regulation with less of a risk weight or something like that, or liquidity weight. Whenever you have this, the investor is willing to pay extra for that nice bond that makes, for example, regulation easier. And in a similar framework than yours, just change funding costs for regulatory cost, you could actually come up with a similar mechanism. So the general idea is even broader than only looking at collateral, but applies to basically all situations, in my point of view, where eligibility matters. Okay, thanks.
Do we have any questions, either here or virtually?
Yeah, so maybe inspired by your discussions, your friendly discussion there, right? I mean, I would have thought that liquidity of the CDS markets also matter, right? So not only do you need to worry about the bid-ask in the bond market, you also have a sizable bid-ask spread in the CDS markets, particularly in the distress periods that you look at, right? So if I am holding an Italian government bond and I want to trade it down, so to speak, and get a lower risk, I'm going to have to buy protection. And that's typically a lot more expensive in distressed periods, right? And there is a sizable bid-ask spread in the CDS market. That's one comment, right? So I think you need to take a look at that. My other point is, so what's the problem with the maturity of the bond, right? The maturity aspect is not just that you need to match them. If you are looking at CDSs, they are really a floating rate instrument. So you need to get an asset swap spread that's correctly calculated on your bond to get it right, yeah? And that goes for both bonds, right? So you need to take them back down to a floating rate instrument, and that goes for both the German and the Italian bond to get it right. Because the time value of money is, and the uncertainty associated with that asset swap is part of the problem, right? And hence I have a 10-year bond or a 5-year bond, it makes a big difference, particularly when you look at the liquidity of the CDS market, which is a lot thinner in the 10-year space than the 5 and 3-year, right? So I think there's something about your curve that makes me wonder if it's not in part reflective of some of those issues, yeah. So I mean, do the basic bond arithmetic to get that right. I think would help convince me at least, yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? I can just add on this. I think I was also thinking on this point on the CDS for the liquidity, but also whether the covenants is it a perfect match at the end of the day on the covenants on the CDS in terms of this, whether there's a perfect hedge in this element, which also matters. And I think then this point about the liquidity premium and reading the paper, I also noted it's probably not it's an explanation in terms of part of the inconvenience yields, but it's probably not the full explanation on the full yield. And I think the paper would benefit in terms of being clear that you're not explaining the full spread, because there will be other components on this as well. I think that would at least be a little bit more convincing. The empirics looks very promising, as said, but this part about that there are probably also other factors at play. I think that's important to stress. I think we know the literature on liquidity premium. Yes. Yeah.
Another question from the virtual audience. Have you considered that sovereign CDS are dollar terms and the inconvenience can represent the Quanto FX effect? Moreover, the repo should be in the inconvenience formula, otherwise the arbitrage relationship misses a part. Thanks.
Do you want to react?
Yeah, so thanks a lot for all the excellent comments. That this was clearly like a very beneficial audience for us to present. That these are very good suggestions. There was a lot. Like I'll just. I don't go against this, but maybe just to note that, like, it's on general it's hard to know these actual funding costs of the bonds, and why Italian for the identification is exactly that for the Italian. I didn't have it here, and we put it to the new version, so where we look at more that when is it so that for Italian bonds it is actually the LTRO programs are competitive to the repo rate, which is for these other Eurozone countries, like maybe the private repo is more competitive, and then we don't see the impact. But points well taken. So thanks a lot.
But it's clear. I think you can make a relatively simple example in terms of the difference on the haircuts and see what should be the kind of theoretical contribution to this, because you can measure the difference, whether it goes from, I don't know, 4% to 7% in the ECB, in terms of saying how much should that explain of the inconvenience yield, because I don't believe, I think like others, that it can fully explain the full convenience yield of the 30-40 basis points or whatever in terms of this. I think that would be interesting to kind of see.